Fascism. You've heard the word a million times, right? Conjures up these really intense images, mostly from the 20th century. But what does it actually mean? I mean, it gets thrown around a lot, but pinning down a solid definition, well, that's surprisingly tricky. So let's try and unpack it together.
So what is this thing we call fascism? Is it some kind of organized, coherent ideology, like you'd study liberalism or communism? Or is it something different? Maybe more of a political movement that's all about passion and action, not some dusty old rule book. To really get to the bottom of it, we've got to look at its core themes.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to break down the fascist worldview by looking at its rejection of reason, this idea of life as a constant struggle, the whole cult of leadership thing, its a really complicated relationship with socialism, and finally where it's all headed, ultra-nationalism.
All right, let's dive right in. First up, the fascist worldview itself, the core themes. And to really get your head around it, you have to understand that it starts by throwing out a lot of the ways we're usually taught to think about the world. It's a pretty radical break.
And that brings us to our first and maybe the most important core theme, a total rejection of reason. Fascism basically sets itself up as the complete opposite of everything the Enlightenment stood for. And the Enlightenment, that's the foundation of so much of modern Western thinking.
So what does that even mean, rejecting the Enlightenment? Well, it means pushing aside things like logic, rational thought, and individualism. Instead, fascism puts all its chips on things you can't really prove, but you can definitely feel. We're talking about instinct, gut feelings, raw emotion, and this almost mystical idea of an organic community that's bound together by history and culture. It really pulls from ideas from thinkers like Nietzsche, who basically said, hey, people are driven by will and passion, not by some neat and tidy logical formula.
And this quote from Mussolini just nails it. Action, not talk, and inactivity is death. That says it all, right? In the fascist mindset, what matters most is decisive action, just doing something, fueled by sheer will. All that endless debate and careful thinking, that's not just seen as slow. It's viewed as a symptom of a weak, decaying society.
Okay, so if you're throwing reason out the window, that leads to a pretty big question, doesn't it? If life isn't about logic and making rational progress, then what is it about? Well, for fascists, the answer is simple. And honestly, pretty brutal. It's about eternal struggle.
And this idea is straight out of the social Darwinism playbook. It basically takes Darwin's whole survival of the fittest idea from the animal kingdom and just plunks it right down on top of human society. The core belief becomes that struggle, competition, conflict, these things aren't just something that happens. Oh no, they are essential. They're the only way to make sure the strongest people and the strongest nations come out on top.
And if you follow that logic, you end up in a pretty dark place. Because if constant struggle is just the way the world works, then war isn't some terrible tragedy you try to avoid. It actually becomes a good thing. It's seen as the ultimate test of a nation's power, its vitality. In this worldview, strength becomes the same as good, and weakness becomes the same as evil. It's that black and white.
So when you're glorifying struggle and strength like that, it's a very short leap to our third theme, a complete and total rejection of equality. Instead, you get this deep-seated belief in a natural elite.
This elitism sorts society into this really rigid three-level pyramid. At the very, very top, you have the all-seeing, all-powerful leader. Their authority is absolute, period. Below the leader, you have the warrior elites. They're the ones who carry out the leader's will. And then, at the bottom, you have everyone else, the masses, who are basically seen as weak and ignorant, and their job is simple, just obey.
And how do they justify this pyramid structure? With a pretty brutal belief, really, that people are just not born equal. Simple as that. Some are natural-born leaders, and almost everybody else is born to follow. This is where they kind of twist concepts like Nietzsche's Übermensch or Superman, this idea of a super-gifted person who's just destined to be in charge.
Okay, so this next one is tricky. It's a bit of a head-scratcher, actually. Because fascism has this incredibly complicated and frankly super contradictory relationship with socialism.
So let's try to pull this apart. On the one hand, you can totally see where they overlap. Early on, fascists sounded a bit like socialists. They didn't like big money capitalism. They talked a lot about collectivism, the community coming before the individual. And yeah, once they got into power, they for sure used the state to control the economy. But, and this is a huge but, on the other hand, they threw out all of socialism's main goals. The second they got power, they started cozying up to big business.
They wanted to save capitalism, not get rid of it. And all those early, more leftist supporters, they were crushed.
I mean, look no further than the name of the Nazi Party itself, National Socialism. That's the perfect example of this whole thing. That socialism part, it was a genius marketing tool, really. It helped them get support from working class and lower middle class folks who were fed up with big business. But the actual economic reality of the Nazi regime, completely different story. At the end of the day, that socialism was just a catchy slogan. It was never the actual plan.
So when you put all these pieces together, this rejection of reason, the obsession with struggle, this whole cult of leadership, they're all building towards one final, ultimate goal. And that's our last theme, a supercharged, militant form of nationalism called ultra-nationalism.
So what's at the heart of ultranationalism? It really starts with one simple, rock-solid belief. My nation is better than your nation, period. It's the absolute, unquestionable superiority of one's own nation above all others.
And we're not just talking about, a love your country kind of patriotism here. This is something else. This belief in being the best fuels this intense, militant, almost religious devotion to the nation. It creates these fanatical national missions that just have to be accomplished, no matter what it takes.
So how do you prove you're the best? Well, in this worldview, there's only one way: military power. The end game here is to prove your nation's dominance through the ultimate test, the ultimate struggle, war, and the conquest of other people.
A lot of this ideology is built on creating a powerful myth. It's all about looking back to some imaginary glorious past and promising a future where the nation is reborn and fulfills its great destiny. The Nazi vision of a Third Reich is a textbook example of this. It was supposed to be the amazing sequel to these great German empires of the past.
So let's just recap real quick. The fascist worldview, when you boil it all down, is this really potent mix of ideas. It's defined by these core themes we've walked through: a rejection of reason for will, this idea that life is just one big struggle, a demand for a rigid pyramid with a leader at the top, that cynical use of socialist language, and all of it driving towards one single destination: aggressive ultra-nationalism.
And all this leaves us with one last, pretty heavy question to think about. If a political movement deliberately throws out rational thought, just rejects it as the foundation for everything, and instead builds its entire worldview on pure emotion, on instinct, and on the sheer will to power, what happens next?